Okay, today's topic is ER diagrams. So what is ER diagram? ER diagram means entity relationship diagram. ER diagrams means entity relationship diagrams. What is an entity? So what? So first what is entity relationship? First we'll go for what is an entity. So what is an entity? An entity is a person, place, object, event, or a concept in the user's environment which contains data. An entity is a person, place, object, event, or a concept in the user's environment which contains data. So in the user's environment, it may be a person, place, object, event, or concept in the user's environment which contains data. An entity is a person, place, object, event, or concept in the user's environment which contains data. So an entity, it is a person or place, concept, event, anything is an entity. For example, if it is person, suppose a person who is in the college, that person will be called as a student. A person who visited to hospital will be called as a patient. A person who visited to shops is called as a customer. Depends upon the environment, will called as a different names. Place. So this is the place. So suppose this town is a place. Object, we know objects. Event or a concept. Anytime it's an entity. There are two types of entities. There are two types of entities. They are, one is a strong entity. Second one is a weak entity. There are two types of entities. One is called as strong entity, another is called as a weak entity. What is a strong entity? An entity which is identified independently, such an entity is called as a strong entity type. An entity which is identified independently. So you are identified independently, so that entity is called as a strong entity. An entity which is identified independently is called as strong entity. An entity which is identified independently. So student, you can identify independently in the college because each student has a roll number. So that's why you are called as a strong entity. You go for a shop, you are identified independently because each customer has a customer ID. If you go for a bank, you can identify independently because you have the account number. Like this, each and every person is identified independently. That's we called as a strong entity. A strong entity can be represented by So a strong entity can be represented by a rectangle symbol. So it can be represented by using a rectangle symbol. So by using some rectangle symbol, it's called a strong entity. It's a strong entity. So that's called as a strong entity. If it is identified rectangle symbol, through rectangle symbol we can identify the strong entities when they are identified independently. Sorry, they are identified independent. When they are identified independently is called as a strong entity. For example, student is a strong entity because each student can be identified by a register number. Student is a strong entity because each student can be identified by register number. Each and every student in the college has a register number. By using that register number, each student can be identified independently. So that's we called as a strong entity. Students. Each student can be identified independently is called as a strong entity. Similarly, we have the weak entity. What is weak entity? An entity which depends on some other entity is called as weak entity. An entity which depends on some other entity, that's called as weak entities. Which depends on some other entity is called as weak entity. An entity which depends on some other entity. For example, if you take so persons, the citizens on US. Suppose a person who has the green card holder, that person will be considered as a strong entity. For example, a person who visited USA for their parents who are visited, so those parents will be considered as weak entities. So they are dependencies. So for the dependencies, they won't give any jobs. They won't give any work. So those such a type of persons will call as weak entities. For example, a person, if you take for US citizens, the citizens you are working in US will be as the green card holders. Those persons will called as a strong entities. They are identified independently. Each and every green card holder can be identified so differently. For example, their parents came to US. Those persons will be considered as weak entities, which are depends. So they dependencies. So we say that those are the dependencies. In US government, they won't give jobs for the dependencies. So such a types we will call as weak entities. An entity which depends on some other entity is called as weak entity. A weak entity can be represented by double line rectangle. We use rectangle symbol, however, we use double line rectangle to represent weak entities. We use double line rectangle. Suppose this is one rectangle. So again we use another rectangle, so double lines. Use double line rectangle, that's we call as weak entity. Strong entity are represented by single line rectangle. Weak entities can be represented by double line rectangle. By using double line rectangle, we can represent the weak entities. Like this, we have the two entities. What is an entity? An entity is a person, place, event, concept in the user's environment which contains data. There are two types of entities. One is called as strong entity, another is called as weak entity. What is strong entity? An entity which is identified independently. For example, if you take a person who is identified independently, that person will called as a strong entity. For example, a person who is in the college, that person is identified independently. So that person we called as a strong entity. Sometimes the person cannot be identified independently. Those persons we will call as weak entities. The weak entities are represented by double line rectangle. By using double line rectangle, we represent weak entities. Weak entities are represented by double line rectangle. So, for example, the citizens of US. If we go for the citizens of US, the persons who are in US. So, a person who has the green card holder, those persons will be green card holders are by birth of Americans. They are strong entities. Other persons are the weak entities. Weak entity persons are dependents. We call it as dependencies. If you go for US, so you are a weak entity because you can't get job. So once you will get identified, then you can become a strong entity. Otherwise, we are in the weak entities. So like this, we have the two types: strong entity and weak entities. Next, we go for attributes. What is attribute? The properties or characteristics of an entity type is called as the properties or characteristics of an entity type is called as an attribute. For example, if you take a student has different properties: student register number, student name, student marks. So like these are the different properties. First, that's called as suppose if you go for bank, so account number, account holder name, branch, so balance. Like this, there are so many fields. These fields will called as attributes. Those we will call as properties. The properties or the characteristics of an entity is called as an attribute. The different types of attributes are unique attribute. Attributes, strong attribute, multivariate, single value, not single value, multi-valued attribute, multi-valued attribute, valued attribute. There are different attributes: unique attribute, single valued attribute, multi-valued attribute, derived attribute. So again we have the derived, single valued, multi-valued, derived. So we have the composite attribute. Composite. There are different types of attributes. So we have the unique attribute, single valued attribute, multi-valued attribute, derived attribute, composite attribute. Like this, we have the different attributes. We depends on the situation we use that attributes. First, we will go for unique attribute. So, what is unique attribute? The property of the attribute is unique in the entity. That attribute is called as unique attribute. The property of the entity is unique. Such attribute is called as unique. Property of an entity is unique. So, unique property, that attribute is called as unique attribute. For example, if you go for student register number is a unique attribute because register number is unique for all the students. For example, student register number is a unique attribute. For example, student register number is a unique attribute. So we can this can be represented by this can be represented by. So how to represent by vowel symbol? So vowel, we take vowel symbol. So this attribute which are identified independently, that's we call as unique attribute. So we make it as underline also. Underline for unique attribute has an underline symbol. So we make it as underline. So it will be represented by vowel symbol. So underline we use. That's the attribute we will call as unique attribute. All attributes are represented by vowels. Unique attribute as underline. Next, single valued attributes. Single valued attribute. For each entity instance, an attribute will contains only one value is called as a single valued attribute. For each entity instance means record. For each entity instance, an attribute will contains only one value, that's we called as single valued attribute. For example, name. For each student has only one name. So it's called a single valued attribute. For each entity instance, an attribute will contain single value, that's we called as so single valued attribute. For each entity instance, an attribute will contains single value. Such an attribute is called as single valued attribute. For each entity instance, an attribute will contain a single value. Such an attribute we will call as a single valued attribute. For example, for each student has only one name. So that's we called as a single valued attribute for each entity instance. So it will be represented. So attributes are represented by vowels. Always attributes are represented by vowels. For example, name. Name is a single valued attribute. It's a single valued. So it's a single valued attribute. So it's a single valued attribute. For each student has only one name. That's why it will be represented by a single valued attribute. Multi-valued attributes. What is multi-valued attribute? For each entity instance, an attribute will contains multiple values. That's we called as multi-valued attribute. For each entity instance, an attribute will contains multiple values. We called as a multi-valued attributes. For example, if you take a mobile number, a student can have multiple mobile numbers. We can say that it's a multi-valued attributes for each entity. So there may be multiple number of values. So that's we called as multi-valued attribute for each entity instance. An attribute will contains multiple values. Such an attribute is called multi-valued attribute. For each entity instance, an attribute will contain multiple values. For each entity instance means record. For each record, an attribute will have multiple values. That's we called as multi-valued attribute. For example, if you take a student mobile number, so mobile number is a multi-valued attribute because a student have one or more mobile numbers. That's called as a multi-valued attribute. For example, mobile number of a student is a multi-valued attribute because a student can have more than one or more mobile numbers. So that's we called as multi-valued attribute. What is multi-valued attribute? For each entity instance, an attribute will contain multiple values. Such an attribute is called as multi-valued attribute. Entity instance means record. For each record, a student can have, so for each record, an attribute will have multiple values. That's we called as multi-valued attribute. If you take a mobile number of a student can have one or more mobile numbers, then it is called as multi-valued attribute. It can be represented by double line vowel. How we can represent double line vowel? A multi-valued attribute can be represented by double line vowel. So if you use double line vowel, then it will be a multi-valued attribute. For example, if you take a mobile number, If it is represented by double line, then it is called as multi-valued. For another, mobile number. Mobile number is a multi-valued attribute. So it is represented by double line ellipse. When we are represented in double line ellipse, then it is a multi-valued attribute. So like this, we can represent double line multi-valued attributes. So like this, we will represent multi-valued attributes. Again, we go for derived attributes. What is derived attribute? An attribute value which is derived from some other attributes, that's we called as a derived attribute. An attribute value which is derived from some other attributes. An attribute value which is derived from some other attribute. Such an attribute is called as attribute value which is derived from some other attributes. So that's we called as derived attribute. For example, if you take total marks is calculated by adding marks in different subjects. That's we called as derived marks, derived attribute. For example, total marks. Is calculated by adding all subject total marks is calculated by adding all subjects marks. Then total marks is a derived mark. Then as a total is a, it can be represented by double by dotted ellipse. Ellipse or dotted oval. So it can be represented by dotted. So if you take for oval, so it will be dotted. If it is represented in a dotted, so then it is a what means so will be represented by dotted. Dotted symbol is required actually. If it is represented by dotted oval, then it will be dotted. Please process cycles. Relationships. Not here. If it is represented in a dotted view, then it is called as a dotted ellipse. Actually, dotted is not there in. That's why I am not written. Next, we have the composite attributes. composite attribute. What is composite attribute? An attribute which can be further divided. Such an attribute is called as a composite attribute. An attribute which can be further divided, such an attribute is called as a composite attribute. For example, an attribute which can be further divided, such an attribute is called as composite attribute. An attribute which can be further divided. So if you divide for example, if you take a name can be further classified into first name, middle name, last name. So then it is called as a composite attribute. For example, if you take a name can be further divided into first name, last name, middle name. Then it is a name is a composite attribute. For example, an attribute name can be further divided first name, middle name, and last name. First name, middle name, and last name. So here name is called as composite attribute. Here name is called as composite attribute. For example, if you take name first, if I take name, yeah. So this attribute can again further divide it. So I'll divide this attribute into different types. So further name again further divided into, so I'll further divide. This name, first name, first name, middle name, last. So this is the composite attribute. An attribute name, this name is again divided into first name, middle name, and the last name. This is the composite attribute. Like this, we have the different attributes. What is an attribute? What are the different types of attributes? What is an attribute? The properties or characteristics of an entity type is called as an attribute, called as property, or will also called as a characteristics. If you take a student, the student has different properties: student number, name, marks, register number, fees, everything the characteristics. These characteristics we called as a attributes. The attributes are again classified into 5 types. All the attributes are represented by vowel symbol. There are different types of attributes: unique attribute, single valued attribute, multi-valued attribute, derived attribute, and composite attributes. These are the different types of attributes we have: single valued, multi-valued. Like this, we have the different attributes. So these are the different attributes. We have the different attributes because so single unique attribute, single valued attribute, multi-valued attribute, derived attribute, and composite attribute. What is unique attribute? For each entity instance, an attribute value is unique. Such an attribute is called as a unique attribute. For each entity instance, an attribute value is unique. Such entity is called as unique attribute. For example, if you take a registered number, the registered number is the unique attribute. So in a student relationship, then it is called as a unique attribute. 1 minute, 1 minute, Amma. Hello. Good afternoon. Sir, can you, I'm in class, sir. Can you talk after 1:15? So, unique attribute. Unique attribute has an underline. We have the underline below the name. It has an underline. So then, if below the name it has an underline, then it is called as unique attribute. Single valued attribute. What is single valued attribute? For each entity instance, an attribute will contains only one value. That's we called as single valued attribute. So single valued attribute has the attribute like this. Multi-valued, for each entity instance, an attribute will contains multiple number of values. That's we called as multi-valued attributes. Multi-valued attribute can be represented by double line ellipse. Derived attribute, for each entity instance, an attribute value which is derived from some other attributes will called as derived attributes. For example, if you take marks, marks is derived from by adding marks of all the subjects, that it is a derived attribute. Then similarly we have the composite attribute. An attribute value which is divided into further, that's we call as composite attribute. So like this we have the different attributes in so this long way the entity relationship. Again we go for one example of all the attributes. To go for one example, for example, if you take a student entity, okay, so we have the dotted is also there. I will put a dotted ellipse also. Dotted. So go for insert, vowel symbol, then this, select them, properties. So not clearly visible. I I will change that. It is represented as a dotted shapes. Dotted. Yes, that's called as a derived attribute. Derived attribute is represented by dotted ellipse. So like this, we have the different attributes. So this total marks is an attribute we have called as total marks. So total marks is a derived attribute. Like this, we have the different attributes. So these are the attributes, and what are the different types of attributes in entity relationship diagram. So first we will discuss one by one. What is entity? An entity is a person, place, object, event, or a concept in the user's environment which contains data. There are two types of entities: strong entity and weak entity. What is strong entity? An entity which can be identified independently. Such an entity is called as a strong entity. Strong entity can be represented by a rectangle symbol. Weak entity: an entity which can be identified independently, which depends on some other entity type. Such entity is called as weak entities. Weak entity is represented by double line rectangle. If you represent in a double line rectangle, then it is a weak entity. Next, you go for attributes. What is an attribute? The properties or the characteristics of an entity type is called as a proper attribute. The attributes are, there are five types of attributes we called as unique attribute, single valued attribute, multi-valued attribute, derived attribute, and composite attribute. What is a unique attribute? The property of an attribute. For each entity instance, an attribute value is unique. That's called as a unique attribute. For example, register number is a unique attribute, then we call it as a unique attribute. It will be represented by underline. Single valued. For each entity instance, an attribute will contain only one value. That's we call as a single valued attribute. For example, each student has a name. So that's multi-valued. For each entity instance, an attribute will contain multiple number of values is called as multi-valued attribute. A multi-valued attribute is represented by double line vowel. If you represent double line vowel, then derived attribute. An attribute value which is derived from some other attributes is called as a derived attribute. A derived attribute is represented by dotted ellipse, vowel symbol dotted. So that we have put in dotted also. Composite: an attribute value which is further classified. An attribute which can be further classified. Such an attribute is called as composite attribute. An attribute which can be further classified. That's called as composite attribute. So that's called as composite attribute. We go for one example of all these, how to draw the one entity by using all. For example, so take rectangle symbol. So rectangle is required. Student. I want to make student. Caps. Student has different properties. They'll go for different attributes. So the different attributes, for example, register number, three enough. For example, if this will take over for so student, this is register number. So it's underline attribute. So I'll make it as underline. Register number is a underline attribute because it is a underline. Get underline. Underline register number. So if it is a name, again I want to modify classify, no problem. Name. Name is an attribute. This is mobile number. Or total or marks. Again all these which are connected by a line. Register number. This is the way to represent an entity. This is the complete representation of an entity. So the name of the entity is register number. The properties of the entity is register number, name, and marks. Like this, we draw the entity. This is an entity. So simple example of a student entity. Student is an entity. It has three properties: register number, name, and marks. Like this, we can draw the entities. This is about what is entity. Tomorrow we'll discuss about the relations. Okay. Thank you. Any doubts? Student can chat. If there is any doubt, they can chat them. I will clarify your doubts. If any student has doubt, so chat them. I will clarify your doubts. No doubt? If you have no doubt, okay. Thank you. If you have no doubt, I will leave. Okay. Bye. Tomorrow again we'll meet you. Good morning, madam.